Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining our last call of 2020. Quite a year. Hopefully, not one we'll ever have to repeat. Sorry, I'm still just clicking as people come in. It's quite a constant stream. Just a sec.
I can do that, Charlie, if you want to carry on.
Thanks, Freddie. Yeah, much appreciated. So welcome, everybody. Quite a good attendance. Thank you for your time today. Hopefully we'll put on a good call to justify you giving us an hour and a half of your time. Usual stuff, usual Zoom etiquette. We'll mute you all unless you're speaking. Please do use the raise your hand functions in the participants box if you want to speak. And I think that's it. There's nothing too complicated this time. And there's a chat function as well, of course, if you want to chat to each other. I'll chair the first part of the meeting, then hand over to Liz, who'll chair the main part, our international influence and sport development and peace section. And we've got some great speakers lined up, so thank you guys for coming. And there's a few others who are going to join in just before they present. So we normally start with a little update, little go around the room, say hello, give us a little update from what's going on either at your organisation or something interesting from the sector. And I'll just go round as I see you on my screen. So Rudro, welcome. How are you? Do you want to give us a little update from your world?
Hello, I'm Rudro. I'm the project manager for Leveling the Playing Field. I've worked for Alliance of Sport and Criminal Justice. Been an interesting 6 months, I'm sure, as everyone else, but finally have the project up and running, I think. So we've got some delivery happening across the country, which is exciting. Next steps are to get on with the mentoring stuff. So yeah, those are a couple of updates at my end.
Thank you very much. Liz, you're next to my screen. What's happening in the world of UNICEF?
Thanks, Charlie. The big thing we're working on at the moment is with FIFA on a global safeguarding course for their 211 member federations. So we've been working on the content for course 1 and a framework for the next 4 courses, which will go live hopefully later this year.
Thank you. Sounds exciting. Ben, welcome. Looking forward to hearing you speak later. How's sport and dev?
Yeah, thanks, and good afternoon, everyone. Been quite a busy 6 months for us as well. Been coordinating a few different initiatives for the platform, including a series on the future of sport and development, which I think some of you may have seen. Also, a bit of work around sort of the COVID response and what organizations are doing. And we also just launched, I guess, a partnership with UNHCR, the Refugee Agency on Sport and Refugees. And last part is, I guess you've probably also seen, we launched this massive open online course on sport for development and peace with the Commonwealth and the Australian government, which has gone really well. We've got almost 3,000 learners from 160 countries signed up so far. So happy to share more information on that as well. Thanks.
Thank you. One etiquette piece I forgot. Guys, if you could all just change your names to include your organisation as well, that helps us get to know each other a bit better as well, please. So just click on your picture and the little dots and you get an option to rename yourself. Thank you very much. And while I was doing that, James, how are you? How's the Alliance?
Hey mate, so like Rudro, I'm also from the Alliance of Sport and Criminal Justice. We're very well, and I'll give you an update that we're working with the Thailand Institute of Justice on a global research project looking at the role of sport and youth crime, in particular sort of across primary, secondary and tertiary levels, as well as looking at how multi-stakeholder partnerships can work between NGOs and criminal justice, but very much focused on the point of criminal justice taking the lead on some of those areas. But if anybody would like any more information, let me know, and there'll be a global survey going out in the next couple of weeks, a few different languages, but hopefully you'll see it being promoted around. And please have a look and feel free to share. Thank you.
Super, thank you. Jason, how are you?
Very good, thanks. Good to see you all. Jason here from Upshot. My colleague Preeti, who many of you know, is usually on these calls as well. We've got a big staff meeting with the wider Football Foundation at 3 that she's presenting at. So unfortunately, she wasn't able to join this call today, and I'm going to have to duck out for that as well. So I apologise in advance. Yeah, I've been very busy at Upshot over the last few months as well. Luckily, we've not seen too much of a downside to the number of organisations we're working with, which has been very promising. One of the big organisations that we've recently worked with, I don't know if Preeti mentioned this last time, actually, has been the European Football Development Network. And that's been super exciting for us, really, really interesting. Loads of really interesting football initiatives across Europe that have been involved in that. And many of whom are using Upshot for the first time. So yeah, that's been super exciting and a big, big project for us. So yeah, that was a highlight.
That's exciting. How's Hubert? Jason, is Hubert still part of the EFDN?
Oh, sorry, didn't catch that. I don't know why it was blinked out there. I don't know, actually. I haven't been personally involved in as much of the project, but I think he is, yeah.
Yeah, we remember him when he was running NAC Brader's community scheme many, many years ago.
Oh, okay. Well, if I ever come across him, I'll say hi from you.
Yeah, please do. Lauren, is that from Comic Relief? How are you? Welcome.
Yeah. Hi, it's my first time joining. If people don't recognise me, I recognise some faces from doing the sport and development course myself, so that's quite nice. I thought I'd update on something that isn't directly sport related, but next week at Comic Relief we've got an online discussion, the first section hosted by Lenny Henry and June Sokong, looking at how charity and creative sectors can support Black communities and challenge inequality. And then the second half of that looks at filmmaking. So we've been part of a project called Summer Story, which is a partnership with DocuBox, which is East Africa's only film funder, and it's owned and run by African filmmakers, and they'll be premiering 10 up-and-coming African filmmakers with their films exploring social issues through the eyes of local communities. So we're excited about that, and anyone's welcome to join. I can post a link to register if you're interested.
Yeah, thank you. That sounds great. Is the first one you mentioned with Lenny Henry talking, is that also open to people to join?
Yeah, they're two. I think they're an hour each, one after the other on Wednesday morning next week. But yeah, I'll send the link.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, please do paste it in the chat box, and we'll pick it up and email it across to everybody as well through the Bond group. Ollie, hello mate, thanks for coming. How are you? You just started at the coalition?
I have indeed. Thanks, Charlie, for the invite. Afternoon, all. As of October 1, now part of the Sport for Development Coalition, so a slightly different hat to others might know me from. But pleased to come on board today, and really on behalf of the coalition, which really has a domestic focus. Many of you be aware, UK domestic focus, just looking and engaging with Bond in terms of interlink with the international focused organisations and opportunities for cross-learning. And interestingly, we just mobilised a fairly good section of our network yesterday to support Sport England strategy development. There are a few questions that came up there in terms of the relevance of the SDGs, the Kazan action plan and what have you to domestic policy and strategy. So a good and interesting interlink with focus for this group, and indeed what I'll discuss this afternoon. So again, thanks for the invite.
Thanks, Ollie. Simon, smoothly on to you with you can choose any one of your hats if you like.
Hi there. Yeah, to be honest, Ben is here from Sport and Dev, which is great. I work with Sport and Dev as London consultant, and I also work with the UK Sport for Development Coalition. So our big news is Ollie's arrival, as he said. So I'll leave those guys to it. But yeah, I guess I work more on the comms side with the UK Coalition. So really excited about that, interested to see it develop.
Thank you very much. Sally, over to you.
Hi everyone. I think I've attended this group, but possibly over a year ago now, as I've just been looking over the dates. So hi to everyone, in case you don't know me. I'm Sally and I work at Fight for Peace International. We've got an academy based in Newham, which I'm pleased to say we're now back offering reduced sports sessions. And we've been very busy, I think, during COVID, looking at how we develop our services and continue to reach people online, children and young people online, and working with our alliance partners across the UK and in Jamaica on how we keep in contact with them through the COVID and how we respond. So it's been a busy year.
Yeah, definitely. I think we've all been facing a lot of those challenges.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sally. Drew, hello mate, how's Arsenal?
Hi everyone. Yeah, good. Thanks. Yeah, in terms of an update, I think last time we met, we'd sort of just got back up and running again in Jordan with some activity. Unfortunately, we've had to sort of slow that down again, and so now we're sort of back looking at different ways of remote delivery again. Hopefully, with the idea that as soon as we're given the green light, we can get straight back into face-to-face delivery. And Mairead from who's the director of the Arsenal Foundation is on today as well, so she might be able to give a bit more of an update from foundation stuff.
Thank you, Drew.
And thanks for inviting me as well, and for Drew to alerting me to this group. It's really interesting to be involved, and as Drew said, at the foundation, we're really looking at how we adapt our programs. And our two key programs are in Jordan and in Jakarta. And I think what's been really interesting is the way the partnership has developed and evolved with Save the Children in those respects, and the teams on the ground, and how we've been managing to have virtual workshops and still managing to adapt the program. So I'm always interested to share our learnings and also hear from others about how they're managing going forward.
Wonderful, thank you. Patrick, over to you.
Hiya, this is my first time on the group. I also work for Fight for Peace with Sally, but I work for the Brazil side of things. So I was based in Rio for 4 years, just moved to Brussels. And our big news from this year is we got funding for a project with UNICEF for COVID emergency response with a focus on mental health for young people we work with in the favela, and we've just got an extension for that project to replicate in other favelas. So that's good news on our side.
Yeah, brilliant. Congratulations. Jake, nice to see you. Over to you.
Hey mate, how you doing? Hi everyone. I'm Jake. I used to work for a charity called the ATT Foundation, but earlier this year we've decided to rebrand, and we're now called Play It Forward. And that was decided to kind of merge with one of our long-term partners in Zambia. And thanks to Steve from Kick for Life, who helped us through that process as well. And so we're now a charity and a football club with local registration in Zambia. And we look forward to making new partnerships with some partners out there, and including carrying on our programs with Tackle Africa that we've done for the last few years. So hopefully you'll hear a bit more about us.
Thanks, Jake. Matt, welcome. Great to have somebody from War Child in the group, the call.
Thank you. It's nice to meet you all. Thanks for having me. So no real updates from me as you mentioned, this is my first meeting, and I think the first time somebody from War Child's come along. Thought it'd be really useful to join because we're in the early stages of exploring how football specifically, or sport for development, could be integrated into our kind of more traditional interventions in conflict affected countries. So yeah, just again, thanks for having me. It's great to meet you all and great to be connected.
Well, Matt, welcome, and again, welcome to anybody else who's new or joined for the first time. It's great to have you. Please do, if you want any introductions to anybody in this group, just put it in the chat and we'll make sure that happens. So we've had Simon. Welcome, Simon.
Hi, everybody. So yeah, second Simon. Simon Rowe from University of London, from SOAS. I've been to the group a few times, but for those of you who've not met me before, I do work on sport and diplomacy particularly. So I've come across many of your organisations, if not you directly in the past, in that research endeavour. But I'm here also to offer some thoughts a little bit later on about the FCO and DFID merger and what we might do as a sector to take advantage of that coming together, such as it is. Also a little bit of individual news is that this week various Erasmus Plus awards were made, and given this is the last time as a UK scholar, I was able to apply for one. We were able to secure a project looking at particularly an EU sport diplomacy framework with colleagues in Paris and Madrid, Milan, Strasbourg. So we do have an interesting project there to look, and particularly across as a pan-European enterprise. It builds out of a previous project that some of you may have been aware of around sport diplomacy at the EU, but this is a pan-European endeavour. So I may well be in touch with various of you about that over the next 2 years. It's a 2-year project, so look forward to taking that forward too.
Great, thank you. Sam, right to play, how are you?
Hello, sorry, trying to unmute myself for too long. Good, thank you. So I guess an exciting piece of news, which I think I mentioned initially in my first meeting last year, was to do with Right to Play's partnership with Liverpool Football Club. So it's been a long time coming, but we finally launched our side-by-side campaign. So that went out on Monday. And so, yeah, just really exciting for the coming kind of weeks and months with regards to what happens next.
All right, my connection might be struggling. Thank you, Sam. Can everybody still hear me? Yeah, okay. Over to Pete Bealing.
Hi everyone, I'm Pete, work at Comic Relief in the Sport for Change team. I guess our main bit of news, we've had a couple of Sport for Change funds close over the summer, but we've more recently we've had our more kind of non-sport specific Changemakers Fund, which is our main fund for the next year, which had over 1,000 applications. So it's now the hard work starts in getting through all those and shortlisting and reviewing and inviting people to the next round. But there are a good maybe 30 or 40 Sport for Change projects that kind of that appeared within that large fund, which is really great to see when organizations from our sector kind of are able to apply to other non-sport specific funds. And this was really about having long-lasting change. So like the criteria was all around like projects that had a kind of an immediate impact, but also sparked perhaps more like institutional or systemic change further down the line. So fingers crossed there's some sport ones that make it all the way through that process, and when they do, we'll share some of those projects because I'm sure they'll be really interesting.
Thanks, Pete. 1,000 applications sounds fun. It's a good thing you're not changing your grants management system at the same time, isn't it?
Yeah, Salesforce, eh? The joys of a creaking old grant management system, and then a newfangled system that no one knows how to use.
Steve, Kick for Life, how are you?
Hey guys, nice to see you all. Yeah, been an interesting year, as for everybody else, responding to the challenges in terms of our programming, also our social enterprises, which have been closed since March, trying to get those back open now. Probably the most notable thing to mention is a new project we've been delivering this year called Raft, which is using those experiences we've had at Kick for Life to help other sport for good organisations around the world respond and be sustainable going forward. So Raft stands for Reduce, Adapt, Fundraise and Trade. And we've been working with 15 organisations around the world, many in Africa, some in Europe and USA, taking them through this process of responding to the challenges and ultimately coming out of it with a more diverse funding base and in a better sustainable position going forward, and social enterprise being a key part of that process. So it's actually been really interesting connecting with so many organisations and hearing so many positive ways in which organisations have adapted and protected their organisations, protected their staff and their participants. So it's been personally a really positive exercise, and good to connect with people, even though we can't do it in person.
Steve, is there any sort of trends or good practice that's coming out of that you could share with this group?
Yeah, I mean, there's loads. Yeah, I'm in the process of trying to consolidate it into a report, which I'll share with everybody. But yeah, different ways of adapting program delivery. So moving from maybe football into fitness, where people aren't, connecting, adapting their fundraising activities. So moving from a gala that was happening in person to a virtual event. Yeah, loads of different types of ways, and enterprises as well, like responding to the changes in the business environment to create new ways of income generation. Some exciting things happening there too.
Super, thank you. Well, if we can see that report in the future, that'd be really good.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Last thing from me before I hand over to Liz and our guest speakers is that this is my last meeting as co-chair. We have a system now where we have 2 years each, and my time is now up. So if any of you would like to put yourselves forward to co-chair this group along with Liz from UNICEF for next year, we'd love to hear from you. It's honestly not much work. It's quite good fun, and you get to get well connected with everybody in the sector. So if you would like to, or you know somebody else who might like to, please do spread the word and get in touch with us. Yeah, so that would be really nice to hand over smoothly to somebody else for 2021. Cool. Okay, that's it from me. Liz, over to you.
Thanks, Charlie. And I'll just reiterate that call for a co-chair to come join me. Really looking forward to whoever it is that puts their hand up and comes to work with us on this. And it links a little bit to the item we've got at the end of the agenda today, thinking about the aims and objectives of the group going forwards and how we're going to, really serve you as a group most effectively into 2021. And as part of that, for 2020, we've got a brilliant set of 4 speakers coming up. The first 2 speakers are going to be talking about something called the Kazan Action Plan. Some of you may be aware of it, some of you may not, but also looking at broader sport for development and peace trends internationally. And then we're going to focus in on the DFID and FCO merger and what are some of the impacts and opportunities for us as a sector. So I'm going to kick off with the Kazan Action Plan, and I'm going to hand over to Ollie, who has been at the heart of driving this work forward in his role at the Commonwealth Secretariat. So Ollie, if I can hand over to you.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks again for invitation to be involved today. I started sort of the introduction as Charlie did the sort of, I don't know what you call it virtually. It's not 2 at a table, 2 at a virtual table, 2 at a Zoom screen. Started that with the new role providing back-end support for the coalition of UK focused sport for development organisations. And I'm actually going to finish this intervention back at that point around the real relevance of key trends of international sport for development policy manifesting in the Kazan Action Plan and that relevance for domestic networks and potentially the interface of that domestic network with this group. But before I get there, I might go back to March. And a lot of us spoke about the challenges that we've all faced collectively, individually, in the communities we work with since March. Like probably many of you, that was in my former life at the Commonwealth Secretariat, where I headed up that intergovernmental organisations sport for development work. Last mission, as we call it, in that space. I know Liz is smiling because of being in that UN type system. Last mission was actually to New York with 2 purposes. One, to engage on behalf of sport for development, sport policy community in the UN Statistical Commission, the official space for sort of global and population national level data within the UN statistical system. And then secondly, work with the group of Friends for Sport chaired by Monaco and Qatar, who play a key role in the sort of negotiation and development and support for both the Secretary General of the United Nations reports on sport for development and peace and the resolution every second year at the UN General Assembly on sport for development and peace. And there was a key message that came out of both of those sort of groupings, one with a sport focus, one really had never, in terms of that Cisco Commission, very little engagement with sport's contribution to development. And it was, what is the relevance of sports interface with global development priorities at a scale, national level for those central government stakeholders that we work with, for the key drivers in the UN system that we work with. And if I can share my screen, I'm actually not going to then move and start with the Kazan action plan. I'm actually going to start with an output that group of friends has helped support and has been released in July, but then has been made public into August. And that is the biannual Secretary General's report on sport for development and peace, which will go to UNGA, or UN General Assembly, this year. And you'll see the overview there. This report, as many of you would know, many of you have engaged with it, some of you know have submitted into it in the past, provides a review of the contribution of sport to the SDGs and the 2030 agenda. Now, this year's report does have a specific focus on the impact of COVID and the adaptation and potential contribution of sport within that environment. But it very clearly outlines that this is done through the global framework for mainstreaming and promoting sport for development and peace. And the Secretary General's report, which is produced by Secretariat and supported by UNDESA within the UN Secretariat in New York, as opposed to the UN agencies that are based, say, in Geneva or particularly UNESCO in Paris. It speaks to that global framework essentially being framed by two policies, or two policy documents, two policy frameworks. On one hand, the Kazan Action Plan, which we'll speak about today, and on the other hand, the Global Action Plan on Physical Activity. And I think this is quite an important point. As you get through that report, as you get to, I think it's page 12 or what have you, there's I think for the first time actually in a Secretary General's report, actually some quantitative data, and it analyses the submissions from both UN agencies and member states and how they align to what they're calling overall policy goals or objectives of the SDGs. And you'll see them there on the screen. Now, remember, this is framed as the global framework for mainstreaming sport for development and peace, not the interface of sport policy with the SDGs. And I think this is absolutely critical point in terms of influences and trends around sport for development and peace policy, because you'll see some issues there which just traditionally fit much more within the realms of sport policy as opposed to what we might say the intentional use of sport. So I want you to keep that data set in our mind as we progress. But let me go back one step. As it said in the intro, a lot of us are aware and have engaged in the Kazan Action Plan, some of us not so much. Essentially, just to put us on the same page, it is the outcome of the 6th International Meeting of Ministers responsible for sport and physical education, held in Kazan in 2017. In a nutshell, and to cut a really long story short, it's essentially a commitment from sport policy stakeholders and to an extent, some education stakeholders, although primarily sport policy stakeholders, to link sport to physical education to a lesser extent and physical activity to an even lesser extent, because GAPA already does that. Link those 3 policy areas to the SDGs and provide an overarching framework for that policy link. That overarching framework includes 3 main policy areas, essentially access at scale, direct intentional links of this policy area to targeted SDGs, and the mainstreaming of integrity and human rights issues across this agenda. We'll get to a reflection on that as we go on. Now, for me, that policy framework has had 3 key influences on what we might call sport for development and peace policy, public policy. And excuse me coming at this through a public policy lens. It was my last job, and now domestically it's my job now. So you'll have to excuse me in that regard. But essentially, it is moving the discourse around sport for development and peace policy from being seen as an international cooperation policy piece to a domestic policy piece. Now, when we have the discussion after this, I'll be interested. There's probably another D here in terms of the diplomacy piece. And there's probably one person in particular on the call, I can imagine we'll have a view on that. But essentially, we've seen this shift from it being seen international to domestic. Now, if you look really when there was the first institutionalization of sport for development within the UN system, and I think Armstrong and Collison described it well in terms of who was around the table when we went into the first international working groups on this space, International Year of PE in the early 2000s. It really was those in the international cooperation space, along with NGOs and IFs. And that was the space in the early 2000s. If we fast forward, and here's this will be a bit of a trip down memory lane, meeting of the International Working Group on Sport for Development and Peace. There's a bit of a shift here. This is around 2012, maybe 2013, where the governments in this space from UK, Norway, Australia, were really in the international cooperation space. Those on the picture from Ghana, from Zambia, from Japan were more domestically orientated. And then we had a mixture of major NGOs, Right to Play's there, UNICEF's there, you probably see in the picture, and other UN bodies. So a bit of a shift. If we look at this year's report from the Secretary General, essentially, almost half, or around half of the submissions were all about clear alignment to national policy or the establishment of policy frameworks at a national level around sport for development and peace. And I think that's a signal of that shift from international cooperation to being a domestic policy issue. That then links to another component that I think the Kazan Action Plan and the discourse around it has helped frame, moving from a projectized approach to a scaled approach. Just for example, this is just one example of, I think, I won't say traditional, but some of the outcomes that we would speak to in the sport for development space. This is USAID's evaluation of the Agana program, which some of you would know, employability and I suppose really employability program across Latin America and the Caribbean. And we've got some of the soft skills that we often talk to, and here's some of the data on before, after, and control group comparisons around some of the soft skills. Now, to be fair to Agana, there also is the hard set of skills around into sustained employability. And this is probably where we traditionally look at in terms elements around this in the sport for development space. This is a space the government interested in. Here's the National Development Plan of Namibia, launched a year ago, and looks at the role that sport can play primarily in contribution to national employment. So we're at different spaces. I mean, contributory, but of course the skills that we saw there, Agana are evaluating, contribute much broader than those who are working in the sport and broader industry around sport. But still, this is where the policymakers' space is. We can go a step further and a bit more nuanced. You'll see here, this is European data from Eurostat, which starts to look at actually the percentage of young people of the total percentage of people employed in a sector. And the blue dots, or the blue stars, is the average across all industries in Europe. The yellow bars are the percentage of young people as a percentage of total number employed in sport. So it's either a policy argument, investing in sport-related, industry sport-related approaches actually has an opportunity and is beneficial in stimulating youth employment, the key issue for multiple policymakers at the international UN level to national level. Now, there's a whole range of issues around quality of work, but the point stands. Potentially a midpoint between these is when we start to see very clear and more scaled sort of outcome data, which draws on the softer skills, puts it very practically into sustained employment and talks at scale. And then many of us will be aware of Magic Bus and some of their impact data, and we'll see it here. Critically here, it also brings in a quality element around the type of work, because my concern here, 0-hour contracts, very insecure employment. Nevertheless, we see a process from projectized to a much more scaled consideration of sports interface with development, and particularly the SDGs. And that example I used, very clear linkage into SDG 8.6 around number of people, young people not in education, employment and training. The last issue, and influence, and it very much links to, say, that example around quality of work, is if my technology doesn't, oh, fantastic. I'm not going to blame the facilitator who made me look at a personal chat around how long I've got to go, but I'll take responsibility for my own technological shortfall there. But it's going from an issue-orientated approach to a much more systemic, structural view around this policy area. You'll see here, and here's a report released by Wilfred Lemke's office in, again, around 2011. And it really looks at the contribution of sport very much in terms of projectized around contributions to sort of more specific output areas, and then leading into sort of thematic outcome areas. We don't have time today, but if you analyse in the Kazan action plan, both the targeted SDGs and in particular the SDG targets that are outlined where sport can contribute, it is very much probably half and half between, okay, can support employability outcomes for young people not in education, employment and training, SDG 8.6, but critically, the governance both in and through this sector that can be influenced contributes to the SDG targets around SDG 16, around effective institutions, around good governance. The targets around the structural issues of gender inequality, structural issues around violence against children. As an example, and then again in the formal life, you see here an analysis of the interlink between what was an analysis on the left of policy work on sport integrity and human rights, and on the right, SDG 16.8. You can see a clear sort of crossover here in that policy consideration of where does sport intersect with the SDGs. So with that, I think there's been three key influences. The discourse is moving from international to much more domestic policy, from a projectized to a scaled approach, from issue-orientated to what's the impact on the systemic issues. And this certainly, I suppose, mirrors some of the shifts from the MDG era to the SDG era, which align to this. Given the Kazan Action Plan is about aligning sport policy and the interface of sport-related policy, of which SDP fits in, and the SDGs, that's probably not surprising. So to close, I think three implications for this group and more broadly. It's critical, and this is a challenge for those in the international cooperation space, that convergence between the strategic investments or strategic delivery and domestic policy agendas, subcontinental and continental. So, that could be the National Development Plan 5 of Namibia. It could be the key policy priorities of SADC or Agenda 2063 of the Africa Union, as much as those of which sort of our key partners might be aligned to. It's critical that actually the governance issues and human rights issues within sport for development, and also the opportunities to implement this through sport for development, become much more central. And we've seen parts of the sector which are ahead of the game and really are driving this space, and others where we have a gender equality initiative of which every coach, board member, and all those involved in the leadership of the organisation are male. Thirdly, absolutely critical on the scale question, the element of domestic coalitions to catalyse and cascade to answer the scale issue. I don't think anyone who understands what effective interventions are talking about taking localized, context-specific interventions, of which is their strength, and trying to scale them like a franchise. But how do we draw together coalitions at a domestic level, and those who partner with domestic organisations, supporting them to work in coalition to be able to influence and support policy in this space? We've seen examples of this. The Sport for Social Change Network in South Africa is in a much more engaged with national policy, both in sport and rec South Africa and in the education policy space. We've seen the Maiden Network in India have an influence in policy. We've seen examples of NGO networks in the Pacific really driving elements of policy through Pacific Island Forum. And of course, this is a key focus of the Sport for Development Coalition in the UK. And I think the learning that can come between how we're working domestically in the UK as a coalition around this scale issue, and then how the Bond Group engages with those coalitions that operate in domestic environments, of which many of you work, I think is a key interface, and why I'm very interested in my new role to engage and be part of the discussions around this table. With that, as always, great to engage with many of you around the table, and thanks for the invitation today.
Thanks so much, Ollie. I think those of you that are new to the Kazan Action Plan have just had the ultimate whistle-stop tour from Ollie there. I think quite often we get focused on the project and we forget about the broader policy landscape and how important that is, in particular for taking good practice to scale. So I'd really urge you, if you are interested to know more, go and look on UNESCO's website, find out more about the Kazan Action Plan, and have a look at where your programs can interact with it. There will be time for questions, about 5 minutes at the end. So if you do have any questions as we go, please type them into the chat box and we'll come to those at the end. But now I'm going to hand over to Ben, who's going to talk more about some of those big trends within the Sport for Development and Peace sector. So Ben, over to you.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Liz, and thanks, everyone. Just checking everyone can see my screen. Maybe you can just give me a thumbs up if it's all good. Great. Thanks a lot. And yeah, tough ask following Ollie and talking about the Kazan Action Plan, given his expertise in this area. And I think he gave a incredible overview there of that and current trends. So I'm gonna talk a little more briefly about the SDGs and the Kazan Action Plan, and a little bit more about some sort of current trends we've observed at Sport and Dev, the international platform on sport and development, through a recent call for articles and engagement we had. And then I'll talk about some possible steps for moving forward. So, as Ollie's pointed out, I mean, the SDGs and the Kazan Action Plan have really provided a common and widely accepted framework, for sport and development policies, programs, and projects. There's also a key focus here, I think, on moving from policy to implementation and that commitment, which Ollie outlined, and the targeted approach. So not necessarily saying sport can do everything, but let's be targeted about where sport can make the most impact. Let's design intentionally and let's measure robustly, which has often been lacking in the sector, especially at scale. Again, as Ollie laid out, the three focus areas, sort of inclusive access for all, which we do not currently have within the sports sector. There's huge inequities in access, as we know, along many variables: gender, race, age, socioeconomic background, etc. Maximizing the contributions of sport to sustainable development and peace, and linked to the identified SDGs, and protecting the integrity of sport. The Kazan Action Plan is a very comprehensive plan. It's been widely adopted, and much work has been done on this by many stakeholders, and continues to be done. However, I think just given the existing inequities and the current challenges we face, including the COVID crisis, it may be worth asking a few questions of sport. Firstly, can the Kazan Action Plan be fully realized within the current sport ecosystem? What are the limitations and challenges to maximizing sport's contribution? And is it time for sport to change? And if so, how, why, and for whom? So at the international platform on sport and development, sportanddev.org, which many of you know well and you contribute to and are involved in, we launched a call for articles a few months ago on reimagining the future of sport and development. We received contributions across all 6 continents and a wide range of interest in this subject matter, reimagining the future of sport and development. And we identified 10 key themes, and I'll run through these quickly. One was the need to build a more equitable and inclusive sport for development and broader sports sector. Sport and coronavirus are often both described as a great leveler, but we know this is not true, that inequities exist and they exist widely and deeply. And we need to ensure previous gains made are not reversed. A second insight was the need to invest in grassroots sport and sport for development, providing access to all and paying special attention to marginalized groups that may be even more marginalized during the current pandemic. A key insight was around the need for elite sport to change. Some of the contributors pointed out that elite sports don't always serve society's best interests. There's need for improvements on governance, transparency, and leadership, as Ollie's also pointed out, and obviously a focus on sustainability of this model. A fourth theme was the need to focus on people and communities and not just the sport itself. So while the sport industry may have been on pause, sport itself has been as important as ever in many regards during this current crisis and remains so. The need to unite different approaches and actors, and I think Ollie spoke really well about this, that, you know, the SDGs, the Kazan Action Plan provide a compass, they provide a common framework for different actors to work together, both within sport and beyond sport. And we definitely need to be going beyond sport actors if we want to really mainstream the use of sport. So while there are distinctions between sport for all, sport for development, and elite sport, ways of linking these more clearly and coherently can strengthen the sector and partnerships. Gender has been touched on a little bit, and the need to ensure and promote gender equity in and through sport is critical. Domestic violence is increasing, and the structures that control women and girls are often increasing in various contexts due to COVID. Sexual and reproductive health and rights services, as many of you may know, doing the work you're doing, are restricted during this time. So the role of sport in promoting gender equality and transforming gender stereotypes is incredibly important. Adapting delivery models, I think this is the sport and development sector has generally innovated pretty well here. We've seen many organizations go online, which has been effective, bearing in mind there are also digital divides that we need to be mindful of. But the use of technology has provided chances for some programming to continue. Online resources have been created by many actors, including the Commonwealth. And this has been something that is, I guess, a theme throughout sport and development, is the adaptation and innovation. The role of sport in mental health and trauma, I think, is clearly important at this time. The use of sport for healing, trauma-informed approaches, and the fact that mental health issues may be increasingly neglected at a time like this. Finally, the last two themes, one was the need to promote teaching, learning, and research, really to train new leaders in the sector, build capacity in the sector. And as mentioned, we've seen that the online course launched by the platform, the Australian Government and Commonwealth Secretariat, seems to have really met a need in the sector to build capacity among individuals and organizations to design, plan, deliver, and monitor and evaluate programs and policies for sport and development. And this is important to bridge a gap between policy and practice that often exists in this sector and others. And finally, and I guess a sort of an overarching theme really is identifying challenges and how can we turn these into opportunities. I mean, the reality is that for many organizations, their future really is at stake. The future of sport for development may even be at stake in the broader spectrum. There's a potential for greater inequality between and within elite sport and sport for development. And there's a risk of greater power and resources in the hands of a few. And I think some actors are struggling and will struggle to survive. However, this is also an opportunity for sport and development actors, as we can play a key role in the response. And if we can do this in a coordinated and coherent way, in some of the ways Ollie also pointed out, this is a great chance to demonstrate the value and viability of investments in sport and sport for development. So, sport must change. This came from one of our contributors. This was true before coronavirus and still will be true well after and during, I would add. So moving forward in the last few minutes here, it's clear that the SDGs and Kazan Action provide a common framework, and great progress has been made in moving from sort of policy to implementation. Great progress has been made in setting up measurement systems and frameworks to better articulate and analyze the contribution sport can make. However, I think the capacity of sport to contribute to meaningful and sustainable change will be limited unless the sport ecosystem itself is meaningfully transformed, and the level of systemic change that Ollie was referring to earlier. So this includes ensuring, greater access, equity, diversity, inclusion, and I would add social justice. The current model of elite sport may actually work against many development outcomes in some ways. And I would just pose the question that, is it time for us to take serious sport less seriously? And should we be more serious about sport initiatives that seek to develop people first? Recognizing there's obviously an interplay between these, but it has been seen historically that sport has been taken seriously when the sport is serious, when in fact many outcomes may be realized from less serious sport initiatives that focus on people and communities first. Just quickly, and a little bit about Sport and Dev and what we're doing to try and redress some of these issues, not alone, of course, working with partners, working with networks, working with many of the people in this room and beyond. We have plans, and Simon can also elaborate on these, to build a sort of Sport and Dev 2.0, an upgraded platform and website to meet the new and existing needs of all stakeholders on one modern platform, both within and beyond sport. And this is informed by the needs of our users, as well as global policies and plans, such as the Kazan Action Plan, the UN Action Plan on Sport for Development, Peace, GAPA, and others. A few future improvements we envisage that could help democratize the sport for development sector, help ensure greater access and equity, include enriched organization directories and new project profiles. A research and learning section where we are able to profile the level of research, the gaps in research, and collate both academic and applied program research. Enhanced collaboration and groups for knowledge sharing. Ollie spoke briefly about the franchise model of franchise sites, but the idea of regional sites, sites by thematic area that can profile the work happening at domestic and regional levels. An increased ability to filter both research programs and organizations by relevant fields such as the SDGs, the type of sport used, type of organization, region, and so on. Multilingual content is key for us. We would like to be able to automate translation into the 6 UN official languages. We recognize that the sport for development sector can be at times Anglo-centric or Anglo-dominated, and that there's great work happening in other regions such as Latin America, the Middle East, and so on, that is not often profiled to the extent it should be. And in addition to that, greater usability and ways for members to interact, and a new learning management system to host online courses and capacity building initiatives, not just the online course we have developed, but of course, many other courses such as the safeguarding course that Liz has alluded to, and many other learning courses and mechanisms out there. So finally, just to conclude, we feel that, this work to an upgraded sport and dev with partners will enable greater inclusion, equity, and access, and help strengthen a coordinated approach to sport and the SDGs through a few different ways, through supporting global, regional, and local networks. Some of you may have heard of the network of networks concept that Simon is leading on, providing comprehensive directories, mapping relevant research and providing learning opportunities, ensuring greater diversity of language and voices, increased interaction and usability, improved coordination and partnerships. I think quite critically, bridging the gap between policy and practice that continues to exist in this sector. We often have well-developed policies, well-developed intent, and grassroots actors on the ground are often quite disconnected from these and do not feed into these in the most coherent ways. And finally, advocating for the value of sport for development, the work that all of you are doing and many of us are involved in given the current crisis. So that is where we are. And I would just like to take the opportunity to say thank you so much for having us, Sport and Dev, on this platform. It's great to interact with everyone. Happy to take any questions and share any insights with anybody else. So thank you very much. I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Ben. Really interesting to hear about that agenda, both for change within sport and dev, but also coming from the sector itself. So fantastic presentation. We have had a question come in for the two of you, which Ollie has started to respond to in writing. We're a bit pressed for time, so I'm actually going to invite people to keep submitting questions. We'll get to them verbally if we can, but I'd like to ask my contributors to answer in writing if that's possible. And I'm going to move on and invite Simon to come and talk to us now about the FCO DFID merger and the implications for the sector. So Simon, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for your invitation, Liz and Charlie, and Pretty, who I think twisted my arm on this one. She's very good at that. So I come at this from sort of two points of view. First of all, I should say that I am not a member and receive no government funding, so I am speaking as an independent, as it were, observer of the process. The second thing is that I have had, over the course of the last certainly 9 months this year, 10 month, we're into the 10th, it's flown by, and over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, a dialogue that I'm sure many of you have had with colleagues in Whitehall as a whole, within the Foreign Office, within DFID, within DCMS, within Department of Trade, Cabinet Office to a degree, and in some senses, what I'm going to talk about is a trend analysis of that. I don't have a slide pack as organised as our previous speakers, but I think that's also possibly reflects the fact that I wouldn't have a great deal of, as it were, reliable or verifiable sort of evidence to share. So this is a little bit anecdotal, and again, that's what Pretty asked me to sort of share. But I think it's also testament to the fact that we will each have our own experiences, and I think if we do have some time for questions, then I think actually sharing the experience of government, UK government, over the course of the last couple of years is actually the sort of the trends that we need to observe and the trajectories that we need to be mindful of in terms of the next year or two. So the immediate cause of moving together these two governmental departments that have previously been separate, the relative budgets of them are significant. DFID had a comparatively large budget in government terms, and certainly in terms of in comparison to the Foreign Office. Now, there were, as there are in all bureaucracies, and the UK government is not unique from that, various little petty jealousies and opportunities for different parts of that big bureaucracy that is government. And again, that's not unique to the UK, for them to perhaps bicker a little. And then again, that's no individual critique, it's an observable fact. But what that did mean is that there was some tension at various points. What I would say to that is that, and as I'm sure many of you know who've worked on the ground, is that actually when you were in country, a term which I also find slightly problematic, but nonetheless, that actually these tended not to play out. And actually people who were assigned to an embassy or to a project and happened to be in a geographic space worked very well together. And I think this is the lived experience of DFID and FCO colleagues as was, and why in the sort of body politic of the civil service, actually it's almost incidental adding the D to the FCO email address. And I would sort of stress that also as sort of one of the key takeaways of this. At a pragmatic level, I do not see this as being a significant change. It is a rebadging in some elements, and and the changeover of people's email addresses and office headers and footers of emails, etc., is something that all of us have experienced in our professional lives. But I do think there is some interesting policy drivers to this, and whatever one makes of the current government, particularly given it's had a couple of other things to worry about in the course of the year, in terms of COVID, obviously, and in terms of Brexit, which it's made its a key driver. What the coming together of DFID and the FCO into the FCDO provides is a way to think about Britain's interaction with the world that it hasn't done previously. And I am encouraged genuinely by the dialogue opportunities that has provided. Now, I appreciate I individually am not necessarily representative of all organisations and all possible interests, but I have been impressed by the outreach amongst sort of the middle management of government in the FCO particularly, to consult with different stakeholders. And that's not to say they've managed to touch all organisations by any stretch, but that there is an idea that the way that business was done previously was not serving British national interests. Now, we can argue about, and I dare say there will be a range of opinions, let me put it that way, about what British national interest is, but that we are having a reasonably grown up and diverse conversation about the interests that may be represented nationally, I do think is a significant opportunity. And one of the encouraging things, and again, I'm not speaking out of turn here, is the role that sport has played in that. As many of you know, it's been a feature of my research on diplomacy more broadly in best part of a decade now, and that sport is taken seriously and is engaged with is it wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. Let me be very clear about that. And that may still be peripheral even at times, and it may be something that has a certain cachet at this particular point, but let's take advantage of that if it does. I make I'm not ashamed to say that we should be a little bit opportunistic in this regard. And I would stress that also, as now is a good moment to be in dialogue with your governmental contacts. There is the spending review that is being undertaken again, and that will be harsh in many regards, still includes particularly the opportunities to fill out the sporting dimension when it impacts other areas. So healthcare, and I think that is a really important dimension. Education, and these link very well and can be mapped against, as Ollie has done brilliantly in the past, and will no doubt continue in his new role, against the SDGs. And I think that is a really valuable way of talking to people in DFID, as was, and FCO, because this is a language they understand. And one of the functions of talking to and with government is being translators of what we care about and have concerns about into a language that they, as individuals, are then able to speak to other parts of their government. The third thing I'd stress is really about taking a whole governmental approach to this. So although, as it were, we're talking about FCDO, I would not want to do that to the exclusion of any other governmental department. And again, here I would take the international dimension and the possibilities of that really importantly. We know that when we have greater impact, when we talk across governments, and indeed when we include other organisations, the demonstration that Ollie was able to visually share of the different organisations that are now part of the dialogue. This is the network of networks. This is the real sort of stakeholders in sport diplomacy. This is why it's important not just to talk to government. We can't ignore them, but as much as we might like to at times, but we have to be able to talk to them and introduce them and almost facilitate some of the conversations with other organisations. So the Bond Group as a whole and the collective discussions that we have allow us a way of facilitating those kind of conversations. And I think that's a really valuable opportunity for us as a collective to be able to facilitate and open up access to other parts of the sort of stakeholder engagement, if you like. I think the fourth thing and the last thing that I would leave you with is a particular emphasis on sort of sport diplomacy, which you might expect me to say, but is that as part of the integrated review, the government has put an emphasis on and they're quite wary of the language here, so I would not be beholden to it, but of a soft power strategy. It's something that the governments have grappled with for the last 3 or 4 years of having a soft power strategy. It is settled, and again, that title may change, as a view of, into 8 themes. Now, the first one to have been developed is around sport and sport diplomacy. And I was involved in drafting a toolkit for colleagues in the Foreign Office, now Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, that would assist them and provide a platform to talk about sport in a way that represented British national interest. There was the example I will share was with colleagues in Rome who were going to be, as it were, party to the European Football Championships, where the Welsh team were going to be based for a period of time. So, the UK level representation, England were playing in London, and a lot of the focus would shift to, as it were, the main team. Speaking as an Englishman, there are plenty of others, of course, but the Welsh dimension. So that's actually not just UK government, that's dealing with the Welsh government, that's dealing with the Welsh Football Association, not the UK, or because there is no UK Football Association, the English Football Association. So there's a lot of different stakeholders immediately involved in that conversation. And that was part of the dialogue with, a desk officer who may have no interest in football whatsoever, arriving at their job in Rome and being conscious of all of the other things that could take place. Equally, Rome was going to be hosting some of the other matches. So, for example, I think there was a Spain-Germany fixture that was going to be taking place in Rome as well. And at that point, the UK interest, particularly around Brexit as was, would be a good opportunity. Mrs. Merkel is a football fan. She may well have attended that football match. Is there something that the British ambassador, the British embassy should be doing with their Italian/Spanish/German counterparts at that particular point? Is that an opportunity for a track 2 type diplomacy? So just as an example, and I'm sure we all can think of them, of others, this is what we would want to sort of participate and engage with that diplomatic core as it exists around the world. So yeah, so I will draw my remarks to a close there. I hope they were useful, and if anyone's got any questions, please feel free to be in touch. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Simon. Super interesting. And it's interesting to see this reoccurring theme of, stronger together and alignment and networks that's running through all of the different presentations that we have. I'm going to hand over to Paul for our final presentation. I'll just encourage everyone again, keep typing your questions in the box, and I'll encourage my presenters to be responding to those questions as they come up, please. So Paul, over to you.
Hi folks, I've been on the call now for a while. This is incredibly interesting. So thanks, I've already learned a lot in the half an hour I've been on the call. So I'm not sure, you might not know me, but I'm Paul Abernethy. I'm the Government Relations Manager for Bond. And so we've been working a lot on the merger, but all different aspects of the merger. And so I thought I could give you a brief overview of the political situation in which we find ourselves in, and potentially talk to some. It's funny/annoying actually, because one of my opportunities was to talk about soft power, but Simon's just already eloquently spoke about that. So maybe I can just talk about more to the risks and the political risks that we face right now. So as you're aware, Bond and a lot of our members were predominantly against the merger. We think that actually, well, I won't go over all the points as to why. But now we find ourselves in a situation in which the merger has happened. We're trying to make the best of a bad situation. It's still really hard to try and find out what the priorities of this department are going to be. Certainly from a development point of view, I think there are some clear priorities set forward in the Conservative manifesto that we have seen some movements on. So things like girls' education and 12 years quality education. This is something the Prime Minister is fully behind, and it's something that he's championed for a long time, even before his premiership. Then we know that human rights and open societies is certainly a core purpose of the new FCDO, and that's one of them issues that has always straddled both DFID and FCO, and so obviously it makes sense for them to make that a priority, and especially with Dominic Raab's background, which I don't know if many people know, but he used to be, he's once was a lawyer for liberty, which I was like, wow, I did not know that. But so he has a clear background in human rights. Sorry?
And a trustee for Fight for Peace, I believe.
I didn't even know that either. And so it's obviously an issue that is both close to the Foreign Secretary's heart, but actually makes sense for the new FCDO to prioritise. We've seen a lot of stuff around preventable deaths. So now this is kind of a catch-all issue area for the government, because preventable deaths can mean a lot of things, but I think certainly from an FCDO point of view and from a Conservative point of view, this is predominantly focused around global health, and this was obviously written before the pandemic kicked in, and so that's probably manifested itself now through secondary impacts on COVID. And so, for instance, we know the governments are really keen to start working on famine, and they've just appointed Nick Dyer as the special envoy on famine. So there are some key areas coming out, but until the idea was actually the integrated review was going to spell all of this out in detail. I don't know if people noticed, but yesterday was a bit of a bad day for the government in terms of the integrated review, and there's a lot of speculation going on as to whether something will be announced. We still think something will be announced in either towards the end of November, December. Very top line policies, but still something to give an indication as to the direction of travel which FCD will be going in. So it's kind of hard to nail down specifics. We have been, as the Bond Secretariat, we've been working quite closely with Baroness Sugg and with senior civil servants to try and set out a set of hallmarks and values in which we think FCDO should live by. And one of this is a clear strategy with 4 to 5 clear points around development. And so, so we're just waiting to see what the integrated review looks like. In terms of risks for the sector, and so this is an overview of the political situation we find ourselves in, and not necessarily linked to sport and development, but it still has an impact on all of our organisations and the work that we do. So an incredibly huge risk for us right now is around scrutiny. And so DFID was one of the most scrutinised and accountable budgets in the whole of government. We're already finding that this isn't the case with FCDO. There are some massive transparency issues, especially around the announced cuts. So the government announced 2.9 billion worth of cuts, but they haven't told anyone where these cuts are going to come from. And despite both civil society and the opposition trying to push in Parliament, we've had nothing so far. And I imagine we're not going to see anything from the government until it's already happened. And so this is a massive issue for a lot of our members, and certainly something that we will continue to push. But transparency already isn't great. And considering what we're a couple of months into the merger now, it's not a fantastic start. I think also coupled with this is the lack or the loss of parliamentary accountability. So right now, as it stands, the International Development Select Committee is due to be wound up at Christmas, with all responsibilities for ODA scrutiny going straight to the Foreign Affairs Committee, who, I don't know if people are familiar with the committee, but they have some pretty big issues to work on already, with the likes of China and Russia, and emerging attacks on democracy. It's an already incredibly busy committee, and so their ability to also start to review a huge ODA budget on top of this, it's just not feasible. It's not possible. And all the expertise that the IDC brings, especially behind the scenes, it will be lost. So there is a real concern that actually parliamentary scrutiny and accountability is going to be, it's not going to be it's basically going to be non-existent to what it is now. And so we're working with a whole host of parliamentarians from right across both houses, but also right across parties as well, to try and secure an ODA select committee that will replace the IDC. Now, there are a lot of politics in the way of all of this, and there's stuff around like Labour are going to be losing 2 committee chairs, and so there's always going to be there's meant to be a balance between parties. So a lot of the chief whips are going to have a lot of power in what happens, and actually it's one of them weird situations where ideology probably isn't going to come into it as much as the politics will. But we're working with members now and working with parliamentarians to try and secure an ODA select committee, because we think that actually a committee is needed. If we're in uncharted territory right now, and with the integrated review coming up, it makes sense for there to be across the Parliamentary ODA Select Committee to look at this budget. So that's one of the risks we're working on right now. And as I said before, one of the opportunities, and it was mentioned just previously by Simon, that actually the whole point of this merger, or certainly one of the major aspects of this merger, was to champion soft power. You heard time and time again that development. I think I saw some briefings from Conservative ministers where you were talking about when you go to national governments and they're like, they want to speak to DFID, they don't want to speak to FCO because DFID have all the power. And whether that's true or not, it was quite telling that was one of the major attack lines, or one of the major justifications is for the merger. And so now the merger has happened, considering the power that sport has, I think it's, and especially once the integrated review is announced, I think there's a lot of opportunity to certainly champion that soft power element to all of this. I'll stop talking now. I'm quite conscious I'm Scouse and I talk quite fast, so apologies if people haven't understood me, but I'm happy to put my email address in after this as well. And I'll try and answer questions now, but if people want to get in touch with me individually, then feel free to do so.
Thanks so much, Paul. And it offered a really interesting counterpoint to Simon's, I suppose, more optimistic framing of the merger. So I think that's really helpful. We've got one question just for you, and then I'm going to hand back to Charlie for the last bit of the meeting. So DFID had actually planned a roundtable on sport for development and peace back in April, but then COVID and then the merger. Have you got any advice for us on how we might get that back on the table with the new FCDO?
Yes, so actually, so one of the issues that we've had, certainly, so I agree that one of the major issues that we've had is that we have lost our access to the political office. However, we found that all our contacts in the civil service are still there, and they're more than happy to try and make this the best of a bad situation. We know actually a lot of our civil servant contacts, they want the merger to happen. That's from both FCO and DFID as well. But now it's in place, they want to make the best of a bad situation. So if you do still have them contacts, the good thing from one of the most promising things that the government did is that they said there'll be no job losses this year due to the merger. So it's highly likely your contact is still in place. And so if you can reignite them relationships, then that should be a way forward. I think everyone is preoccupied with the integrated review right now, because this is going to determine a lot of people's work programs, and it could potentially even affect jobs, to be honest. So I think a lot of people are focused on that right now. But yeah, if you've got them relationships, try and rekindle them. If not, political outreach is quite tough right now, but if there's something we can do certainly with ministers, then do get in touch, and I'd be more than happy to try and assist.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Paul. And thanks to all of the speakers. So much rich content. I'm afraid it hasn't left any time for live questions today. I'm aware that we're wrapping up in 10 minutes time. So I'm going to hand back to Charlie now for the last part of the meeting, but I'll encourage everyone to keep typing your questions into the question box, because we've got such an expert panel here to respond to any queries you might have. Charlie, back to you.
Thanks, Liz, and yes, thanks again to all the speakers. That was great. That was really interesting. I'm sure we can carry on those conversations outside of this meeting as well, and we'll get the presentations if we can and circulate them through the bond group. So the last section is just a little bit about the priorities of this group, and what you as members think they should be or would like them to be going forward. We have subgroups that have been active in the past on evidence and influence, Definitely this year's not been as strong as previous years, given the challenges we've all faced and COVID. But there is a subgroup of this group which is trying to collate evidence for the value of sport, development and peace from wherever we can find it, with the aim of trying to create a resource which people can use to search for and then use in their own programming, or to learn from or show people of the value of sport. So that's a working group we have, which will continue. And there is the influence working group, which was the one that had been quite successful making connections with DFID last year. The roundtable was something we're very excited about, and the Wilton Park event, which some of you remember from last year as well, which was a really good piece. Again, not much this year, but just a chance for you guys to fit in now, either in the chat box or speak up or email us what you think this group should be doing. Overall, the aim of this group is always to try and raise the profile of sport as a valid and credible tool for development. Try and make some noise about it and try and convince people to scale it, and help each other scale our ideas. So we want to continue to try and do that, but not sure if any of you got any ideas about how best to do that.
Charlie, sorry, just a very quick one. Raising the profile of sport development and peace, is that raising it nationally or internationally?
Yeah, it's a good question. Raising it to who? I think this group has had on its mind that we wanted to try and raise the profile in DFID specifically originally, as a potential for creating change and then opportunity. And then also we were working on an idea that this little sector of ours is growing, but there is an enormous already established international development sector in the UK that wasn't particularly engaging in sports. And we thought we could try and raise the profile of sport as a tool with the bigger existing INGOs. It's partly why this group was founded within Bond, right? So trying to get access to Save the Children, Oxfam, the Red Cross, the big international players with big budgets who might then be able to take good SDP programming and scale it. And there's been some great examples of that, but definitely feels like there's more that could be done in that space.
If I might just go in on that international dimension, I wonder if there's actually, opportunities to think about some of the sort of transnational or indeed subnational connections that we could make, the sort of people-to-people group that we collectively, the networks that we're part of. Are there ways of shaping, as it were, domestic agendas by having international dimensions to it? Sometimes the voice outside is the more powerful one than the domestic constituent, whether that's in your, at least in my household, or the, national level. So actually, we are collectively well connected internationally. Are there things we could do to bring some domestic pressure to bear in each context from international dimensions? I tend to think there are, but again, it might be something that we could, develop as a group, because we are taking advantage of the contacts we already have. Just another thought.
Yeah, that sounds very familiar to, I think, a thought process I had at Wilton Park, where there were some really interesting government officials from a variety of Commonwealth countries there coming to the UK to talk about the power of sport for their domestic programming, but nobody from the UK government there. So that could have been an interesting opportunity. We've not got a lot of time, so if anyone wants to pick up that conversation or feed into it, please do let us know. That would be really interesting. And there's that thought process can continue for the rest of this year and into 2021. We have one other topic which we have a meeting planned on, which is good practice in women and girls empowerment in sport, development and peace, and that will be a session or a meeting that we run next year. We normally have the first one February or March time, but if you've got other ideas, other suggestions for topics you'd like this group to put on a meeting on, we'd love to hear what they are. In the past, we've done a survey, and we can do that again. But if you've got any ideas now, anybody who's online who'd like to suggest something, we're all ears, or put it in the chat. That would be really interesting and help us start thinking about speakers. That would be really good. Okay, well, please do email us. Liz, I've just noticed in the chat, if you've seen it, we have an offer for co-chair. That's wonderful. Thank you, Sally. I'm sure Liz will be in touch. It was much harder to last time round, so that's really good. Last thing then for me then, I've just said it before, but the next meeting is usually February or March. We'll be back in touch with the agenda, etc. for that. And I just want to take the chance to thank Dana as well, who's on this call. Dana was our intern this year, who supported the logistics of this group. Thank you very much, Dana. If you want to share, there she is.
Thank you, Charlie. It was my pleasure.
Yeah, thank you very much. It wasn't quite what we thought. COVID changed the world. Dana's dialing in from the early hours of the morning, somewhere on the east coast of the US, and has been all summer. So thank you very much. I hope you found it useful, and I'm sure everyone else will agree. If you would like to pick up conversations with anybody on this call or in this group, please do reach out to them.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you once again for all your support this year.
Thanks.
Liz, anything else from you before we close?
Just to say, I think we might come back to everyone with a survey or something to pick up on some of those last points that we talked about, the overall direction of the group, and then the roles of these meetings and the content of these meetings within that. So watch this space and expect a communication coming. We've got a kind of steering group meeting coming up in a few weeks. So after we've had that, we'll send something out to everyone. Thanks very much.
Super. Thanks, Liz. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for all your time this year. And yeah, speak to you soon.